Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome to Inside the Deal, the monthly podcast from Sport Business. My name is Frank Dunn and I'm the editor-at-large of Sport Business Media. Each month on this podcast, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at one deal. It could be a media rights deal, it could be a sponsorship deal, it could be a carriage deal, distribution technology, it could be from any sector, any vertical of the industry. It will not necessarily be the most valuable deal that we've written about that month, but it will be a deal that we think tells us something interesting about where the industry is today and where it might be heading. Now, this month, we're going to have a look at a sponsorship deal that was agreed between the beer brand Budweiser and the Premier League football club Everton. And I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Cronin. He's the global sponsorship editor of Sport Business. He wrote an in-depth piece, not just about this deal, but about how this deal fits into Everton's sponsorship strategy, particularly in the context of its new stadium. Wrote a story earlier this month, August the 18th. So I'm delighted to welcome Ben. How are you doing, Ben?
Good, thanks, Frank. It's nicely timed, this one. The new stadium opened at the weekend.
Yeah, well, we tried to be punctual. We tried to be timely. Now, did you do your homework? Did you watch the game?
Unfortunately, having two kids, they're in charge of remote control these days, Frank. I didn't manage to see it live. I did tune in on Match of the Day later on, so I didn't get a sort of sense of the events around the new venue, the people gathering before the match and all that sort of footage. But I did see the playing on the new pitch. It looked like a really good day for the club. I mean, sun was shining. It was a bank holiday weekend. It's good that they won as well. I mean, I don't think the club would have wanted any narratives about stadium hoodoos, having spent the best part of 800 million quid on it. You don't want that sort of narrative developing in the press. I didn't see, as I say, the stuff, people gathering around. But I was actually in Liverpool a few weeks ago. I was taking a ferry over to Ireland and I did actually, the port in Birkenhead, you can actually see the stadium across the Mersey. And it certainly looks nice. I'm not an architectural journalist, but, it looks quite nautical. I think it's been tastefully done. The sort of silver lettering of the naming rights sponsor, Dickinson, done very tastefully. It's got these sort of brick-clad stands, and it looks really, really great. Sort of looking from across the Mersey where I was standing. And I think there's also a nice story about regeneration. Liverpool, synonymous with the shipping industry. Obviously, that's not quite as successful as it once was. So it's nice that it's based in an old dock. There's a good story there, and I think sponsors have rallied around that. But the true acid test, I suppose, is whether or not, just apart from the football, people actually gather at the venue before matches, hours before the matches, and leave long after and spend their hard-earned money in the bars and restaurants and in the gift shop. So, did you get a chance to see it?
I watched it on Sky Italia. I watched the game live, and obviously, when you're watching on television, it's not the same as being there. But it looked fantastic. The aerial shots, absolutely stunning, and the feeling from watching inside the stadium, I think, probably similar to when I saw the first footage of the new Tottenham Stadium, that you just feel like you'd love to see a game in there. It looks like a fantastic place to watch a football match, but it's very difficult to really get the full feeling on TV. So maybe one day we'll get there and see a game. Who knows? Yeah,
hopefully. Yeah, put the feelers out for some tickets. I think there was something someone said to me about the Tottenham Stadium. They said it was like your favourite pub and there's a match going on in the beer garden outside. If Everton can achieve the same thing, then I think they'll be in a good place.
So talking of beer, obviously, on this podcast, the idea of this podcast is to try to choose a deal which has something interesting about it. It's not just a routine renewal or a bread and butter rights deal. Before we get into that, before we get into what makes this interesting, could you just bring us up to date on the nuts and bolts of this deal, Budweiser and Everton? What is the deal?
So well-placed sources that I've spoken to say that this is an AAV, an average annual value of about 2.1 million per annum. And the interesting thing for me is that, the really important thing for me is the fact that that's over 7 seasons. So it's not your kind of short-term classic Premier League deal. I think the fee starts around 1.5 million per annum, and then it rises with escalators to give that 2.1 million per annum AAV. So that's around, when you count that up over 7 years, that's around 14 million to 14.5 million in contractually obligated income for the club. So that's good. long-term revenues that will put it on a sound economic footing, and also to pay off the cost of the new build. Obviously, that's 800 million, as I said, but it's going some of the way to getting cash in the bank for the club.
Apart from the value, is anything else that struck you about this deal as being interesting or unusual or different in some way from the normal kind of beer football arrangement?
So it's interesting. I mean, if you look at that sort of mid-tier of Premier League clubs, and I'll put Everton in that category, even though they have the odd relegation skirmish every now and again. That's a lot of money to be earning for a sponsorship deal that doesn't confer any kit branding rights. It's not a sleeve deal. And I think a lot of teams in that sort of mid-tier are probably earning that sort of sum of money from sleeve sponsors. So this is not, it doesn't have any kit branding rights. So they've managed to sort of, for me, it's emblematic of the way they've eked out more money from the building of this new stadium. So what Budweiser are doing, they're designated a founding partner. And this is a sort of elevated package of rights, which gives you the right to associate with physical spaces in the new building. And what they're going to be sponsoring is this thing called the Budweiser Fan Plaza. And that's a 17,000 capacity sort of gathering space for fans. Talking about the importance of fans gathering in the venue before and after matches. And that's not just going to host football, that's going to host other events throughout the year. So there's other activation opportunities for Budweiser outside of football. And that probably explains that sort of the elevated fee for that. So they're doing really well, I think, but both the long-term element to it, the fact that it's tied to a physical asset within the building, the fact that they've managed to do that, even though they've got a stadium naming sponsor already in the shape of Hill Dickinson, just shows that they've done a good job with this one. And there are other founding partners that they've managed to bring in a sort of similar level to Budweiser and on similarly long-term agreements. Another point that I could make is that it's a city centre location. They've applied for a license to be able to host concerts there. The club are incentivized to host as many events throughout the year as possible. And even the stadium naming agreement with Hill Dickinson, that's as far as I understand it, has got kickers in it. So the more events that are staged there, the better it is for the club commercially. So when they look at this venue, they've conceived it as a sort of a year-round community hub for concerts, things like outdoor markets. They really want it to be sort of a hub and central to the Merseyside community, not just Everton, but the city in general.
So the partners will be getting visibility around all of those events, not just around the football matches, around everything to do with the stadium.
That's right. Yeah, it will be. So the Budweiser Fan Plaza will be known as the Budweiser Fan Plaza throughout the year. Yeah, even if they're hosting a Taylor Swift concert.
Is that planned?
I don't know, actually. I think so. I'm sure they'll be trying. And
that would be big. That would be big.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask, in terms of the inventory and the structure of this deal, I'm not a sponsorship expert, as you know, but one thing I always hear or read about in sponsorship deals when beer is involved is something called pouring rights, which is often associated with sponsorship by beer brands in sports events. For the benefit of non-expert listeners, could you explain what pouring rights actually means and whether or not that's part of this agreement?
So yes, so pouring rights are included in this agreement. So it's a combination of branding right, the sort of naming designation on that fan plaza, but they've also got the rights. So a pouring rights agreement is where a brewer pays a venue for the right to sell and market its products, and it normally grants exclusivity on certain beverage categories like lager, pale ale, that type of thing. So in this situation, if you look at the beer brands that are being sold in the new stadium, you've got Budweiser, Stella Artois, Camden Pale Ale, Camden Stout. So those are all Budweiser Brewing Company brands. There's also Kopparberg, which is a Swedish brewery that does ciders, and they're not a Budweiser brand, but they've got a distribution agreement with Budweiser. So you can see why they're on tap at the venue as well. But then you do also, I mean, it's a delicate one. There is also Guinness being sold there, and that's not a Budweiser brand.
In general, I'm curious about this. When venues and brands are negotiating around this issue of pouring rights, is there not inevitably a trade-off between offering your fans, consumer choice and delivering value to the brand, exclusivity, non-exclusivity? How does that work? What are the pros and cons of giving somebody pouring rights?
Yeah, so it's a tricky one. My understanding is that was one of the things that it was a big sort of talking point in negotiations, exactly what exclusivity the deal conferred, because Everton are obviously trying to they want to give Budweiser as much exclusivity as possible to eke out those sort of long-term revenues that we discussed. But you're building a new building and you want to get people to stay there as long as possible and spend as much money as possible. So you want to offer as much choice as possible. I think there's probably an awareness that Budweiser is not to the taste of all UK consumers. So there's definitely a trade-off. But the fact that they've got all of those different brands, like a Camden Pale Ale, which is probably a bit more of a sort of a contemporary brand. These big brewing companies, they've got a lot of different sort of choices now. So it's probably not something that's going to get noticed by the match-going fan. There are some clubs that have gone about it differently. I mean, if you look at Arsenal, they've actually split their beer category recently. So they've got deals with different companies like Asahi, Guinness. They've even got a non-alcoholic beer sponsor in Athletic Brewing. So they've kind of subdivided the category rather than go with one single beverage supplier. And as you say, there's a vested interest in encouraging beer sales. And they've also got this 10-year, and another of their founding partner sponsors, Aramark, which is providing the food and beverage for the new stadium. The way that deal is structured is there's a lower base cash fee, and then the club gets a share of food and beverage sales, which could be worth more than £1 million a season, maybe as much as 2 million a season. So there is a vested interest in selling as much beer as possible. You don't want to limit choice for those reasons. Interestingly, Aramark, they're going to be involved in a digital first fan experience. So there's going to be things like self-service taps in the venue. I don't know. I remember when Tottenham opened their new stadium, there was a lot that was made of these beer glasses that filled up from the bottom, and I'd imagine Everton have got something very similar where it's very sort of snappy, and the fan experience there's not much friction involved in the concourses when you're trying to get your beer at half time.
You used a phrase there, and I'd like to go back to it. Probably should have picked up on it earlier in the conversation. Founding partner. Can you explain what that means? Founding partner. Is it a standard part of a sponsorship? Is it something specific to a new stadium? Can you explain what is that?
So this is a new sponsorship designation that was created by the agency. So the exclusive sponsorship agency engaged by Everton, I think it was back in 2022, Elevate. So they're a US-based consultancy firm. And they were very much involved at the ground floor, well, literally at the ground floor, in designing the new stadium with the architects. So they were sort of conceiving of these kind of physical spaces within the new venue so that they could eke out more sponsorship revenues. And founding partners. So these founding partner deals are typically tied to physical assets or spaces in the new building. So as is the case with Budweiser, they've got this fan plaza. So it's a US-based model. You've got your stadium naming rights partner in the shape of Hill Dickinson, but you've also got the opportunity to have, the Budweiser Fan Plaza. There's another one, the watch brand, Christopher Ward, who've got another physical space. They've even got their own watch showroom in the new building. So it's founding partners. They're a higher tier, just below the naming partner. They've got physical assets invariably. They're paying a bit more, and they're often on sort of longer term deals. And if you look at Elevate, they've really become synonymous with this way of sort of strategizing and sweating new venues. I mean, just take another example. They worked with the Tennessee Titans, which is an NFL team. And if you look at the way those US teams are doing it, it's the height of sophistication, the way they're eking out new sponsorship revenues from new builds especially.
So the takeaway for other clubs looking at stadium development is that it's good to have your commercial strategy integrated from day one along with the architectural design. The two things go hand in hand.
That's right. Yeah. A new build it's just such a good opportunity to create new suites, new gathering spaces, and tailor them to the people that you're going to be working with. I'm sure they'll be looking at, if they haven't got a financial services partner already, they'll be looking at getting a sort of a premium suite linked to some kind of rewards based card like a Amex or something like that, where it's tied to a premium experience. And I mean, it doesn't just have to be a new build stadium. You could build a new stand. I think Liverpool, that was the case for Liverpool when they built their new stands. They created new premium suites within that. You could have things like a tunnel club, so that you could have a premium dining experience right alongside the players' tunnel as they're warming up, and going in. It's just it's this sort of once in a generation opportunity to create this sort of gathering space and this kind of rallying point for sponsors to get around and support and fund.
I mean, obviously, the most important of all of the deals, I guess, is the one with Hill Dickinson. Now, that's been widely reported, but could you just bring us up to speed on the basic details of that agreement as well, just for completeness?
Yeah, so that one, it's not as much. I've seen that this figure of 10 million per annum has been sort of picked up by the media, and that's in sort of common circulation at the moment. It's not as much as that. My understanding is it's about 6.6 million per season. That's GBP. Escalators, I think, take it to the base fee to around 7.5 million towards the end of the 10-year contract. But there are also further bonuses and incentives, attached to winning trophies, qualifying for Europe, that type of thing. I think it will probably level out at about 70 to 75 million over the 10-year term, which again is, that's really good long-term revenues that the club's locked in there. And it's also a great category. Legal firms, they don't tend to do a lot of sponsorship in sport. So that's freed them up to go and make some money from other more sort of traditional classic categories like beer, as they have with Budweiser, watches even as they have with Christopher Ward. So it's a good foundational deal, if you like. It's not an offensive, gaudy brand like Sports Direct that's going to be emblazoned all over the new arena. You look at the name across the venue when they were sort of scanned across it at the weekend. You could almost, Hill Dickinson, it almost sounds like a sort of beloved director or sort of benefactor or even a player. I think people have, referred to it being a bit like Dixie Dean, their former striker. So it's a good brand, a nice sort of sober brand to start off with. And that's freed him up to go and strike these subsequent sort of founding partner deals beneath that tier.
So if we zoom out, we've talked a lot of the details, the nuts and bolts of the deals. Big picture, obviously Everton are doing this long term to be competitive. Long term, this has to deliver to the bottom line. It has to make them more competitive. You're a Liverpool fan. Are you worried?
That's a loaded question. So if you look at their financial results, they declared, so the last set of financial results they put out for 2023, 2024, they declared 26.1 million in commercial income. And my understanding is that around 17 to 18 million of that was from sponsorship. So the people I've been speaking to say that the next time, when they do the financial results for the season after next, that will rise to around 36 to 40 million, which would put the club in a sort of in the top 9 for the Premier League. So they're certainly making ground. I think they're a long way off still from the likes of Liverpool, Arsenal, Man United, Man City, the top 6. But 40 million per season would be a great result, but it's still short of the sums that they were doing a little while ago. So just, it's an interesting, just looking back to their results, they declared 63.7 million in commercial income in 2019-20. That's not necessarily the best yardstick, because that was actually when USM Holdings, the company owned by Russian billionaire Alisher Usmanov, was pumping millions into the club. If you remember, they had the training ground that was sponsored by USM, which was the Usmanov company. So, you could argue they're putting themselves on a decent pegging now, still short of that figure, but yeah, that figure wasn't necessarily, that's not sort of guaranteed income from a nice blend of sponsors. That was one sort of sponsor or benefactor putting money into the clubs. As I say, not the best yardstick necessarily.
Look, projecting forward, the state of the Premier League is there's probably not going to be that many new stadiums. Would this model, like looking for a naming rights partner and building this tier of founding partners, would you expect that to be the standard approach in the UK or even in Europe for new stadiums? I heard that when James Pallotta had AS Roma, that when they were their stadium plans, which they had various different stages, that this concept was part of their thinking. So naming rights partner for the stadium and this tier of founding partners on a long-term basis. Would you expect that to become the kind of standard way of doing these deals in future?
I'm sure Man United are watching it closely. And I'm sure, everybody knows that Radcliffe is trying to sort of pitch his new venue as they're talking about this redevelopment as a similar sort of tale of regeneration. That's might be geared to attract the sort of community, sort of purpose-led sponsors. He's also using it to try and get public funding for the venue. I'm not sure whether he's going to succeed in that. It's a model that could be applied to new stands, as I've said. If you're sort of creating these sort of new physical assets that you can monetize. I think there are any other mid-tier clubs out there that are looking to eke out similar sponsorship revenues, long-term sponsorship revenues to Everton, then I think they would certainly look very seriously at deploying this model pioneered by Elevate. The league is kind of bedeviled, especially in that sort of mid to lower tier, by a lot of short-termism, and that's exemplified by the number of betting sponsors that clubs have. I mean, they're going to have to take a longer term approach soon, because it's not easy. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for them, because it's not easy to sort of take a long term approach, because you don't know whether you're going to get relegated or not, and what players you're going to sign, and so on and so forth. Betting has always been a very sort of easy thing to fall back on. These betting brands are totally agnostic about which clubs they work with. They're more interested in media exposure and very willing to turn sponsorship deals around in very short order. Longer term sponsors are very hard to find. So, this founding partner opportunity is arguably only really possible with a new build. And it's much easier when the venue is going to be hosting year-round events as well. So if you're going to build a new venue, you'd have to hope that, it had a license to be able to host your Taylor Swift concerts and things like that. The thing that is interesting about Everton is they stayed very disciplined. And my understanding was they turned down a lot of offers that maybe other clubs in that mid-tier might have just, snapped up. They had an appreciation of, what the most lucrative categories were going to be, and they ring-fenced those. They didn't want to, sell LED inventory to the first comer. They really held all the really important assets back for their big sponsors. And I would say if you don't have a new stadium to fall back on, it's quite hard to have that sort of long-term mindset. But I think, the clubs that cultivate a sort of distinct brand identity, a story that sort of sponsors can align with, they're the ones that are going to have the most success. We've been doing a bit of research on the Premier League recently, and I've been asking the question, well, who do you think's, of agencies, of brands, saying which clubs are doing the best job in terms of sort of defining their sponsorship categories? A lot of people are saying Arsenal are doing very well. They've got a very sort of urban kind of street culture kind of brand identity, and they're leveraging that really well with sponsors like Adidas. And then Liverpool, you've said I'm a fan, you've revealed my fanship, but they are also, by all accounts, doing a pretty good job. It's not to the taste of everybody, but that their campaign, This Means More, is a good example of how they're sort of creating that kind of story that brands can align with.
I'm thinking about how this might play out in Italy, given that between now and Euro 2032, there's going to be a lot of stadium developments. It's not been decided yet which stadiums, but my local club, Bologna, the Dall'Ada, is one of the stadiums which is being considered. The club itself has been looking for, since 2017, 2018, to restyle the Dall'Ada. It was going to be done, and then COVID came along. It was put on pause for a long time, and now the costs have gone through the roof. So it's unclear how that will play out. But I'm just wondering, what's being spoken about here is the possibility of restyling and upgrading a number of existing stadiums. Are there any aspects of this approach that can be adapted? I mean, you said it works better with a new build. And obviously, historically, it's always been the case that naming rights work better with a new build. But is there anything at all from what you've been studying and talking about that could be adapted and could be used for restyling of existing structures?
I think it's all about experiences, and sort of money can't buy rights. So if you can redesign a venue without sort of, putting spades in the ground, but you can still create interesting, unique experiences for fans that sponsors can align with, that's always going to be popular. The new build element is pretty important, because as I said, it's just that ability to create new suites and gathering spaces. And if you can stick a logo on that, so much the better. I think it's a tricky one. There are existing venues that have managed to attract naming sponsors, and you look at Twickenham, they've just recently done a deal with Allianz, not for a new venue, although there are plans further down the line to renovate it, and I think Allianz will probably be involved in that as well. But yeah, new venues are probably the ideal scenario. I mean, one thing I would say is there's definitely a sense of momentum about the UK naming rights market at the moment. There's always been this perception that the UK is kind of lagged behind the US, and they found it harder to sell their naming rights. And, Tottenham, no one's more emblematic of that than Tottenham. But there's definitely, with the Allianz deal and the Hill Dickinson deal, there's definitely a sense that some brands are beginning to get behind the idea of long-term venue naming rights agreements.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for your insight, Ben. That's been really interesting. And if you want to know more about the in-depth coverage of sponsorship in sport business, you can take a look at our website. And if you want to access our huge database of sponsorship deals, contact info@sportbusiness.com. So thanks once again, Ben, for your time. Thanks to
Frank.
everybody for listening. Enjoy your day.